If I could make a Mount Rushmore for environmental leaders in North America, Huey would be one of the choices up there on that mountain.
Brian O'Neill won't forget the first time he met Huey Johnson.
Huey was sitting in a swing in his office, and it was very zen-like, and I thought, my goodness, is this guy flaky or is he for real?
We met on a bus. He told me about a transaction he was working on for the Nature Conservancy, and I got so excited. We got off the bus, talked about it. I signed up for the project, signed up, it turns out, for life. I'm now a Huey Johnson acolyte.
In November 2001, the United Nations Environmental Program presented its most prestigious award, the Sasakawa Prize, to Huey Johnson. He remembers how he first found out about it.
It came as a fax from Nairobi, where the headquarters of this UN agency is. And I carried it in to another colleague in the office and said, "Do you do me a favor, is this real?" I thought somebody was playing a practical joke, particularly when I learned it came with a $200,000 check.
In this case, the prize honored a love for nature that began in childhood.
I had the good fortune of growing up in a small community where hunting and fishing was common practice. My friends and myself would get on our bikes and get our guns and our dogs and bicycle outside of town and hunt for rabbits. I could go out camping and my parents wouldn't worry about me, even as a small grade schooler. So we had that kind of introduction to nature, to sound, to darkness, to campfires. And there were some college professors that came and talked about things like wildlife management. And I think that really sparked professional interest for me.
At Western Michigan University, he studied biology. After a brief job at a chemical company, he set off on a backpack trip around the world.
It became the most important thing that I had done to date. The opportunity to walk through history, to note that much of the conflict of history, wars, inhumanity, people to people, occurred over resource allocation.
After a stint as a school teacher in Idaho and a trip to California, where he fell in love with the sea and the Sierra, Huey began a PhD program at the University of Michigan. But barely a week into it, he saw a notice for a job opening in San Francisco.
I stepped in a phone booth thereon and got the job and dropped out of Michigan and drove west, never to look back.
It was 1963. He'd been hired as the first West Coast director of the Nature Conservancy. His job was to find ways to purchase open space and preserve it for posterity. It wasn't easy to persuade landowners to sell to the Nature Conservancy when developers were offering more money. But Huey did.
He's always been able to say, "I know what's right. I'm sure I can convince you. If you'll just let me talk to you long enough, I'll get there." From him, I first heard the expression, "a million cups of tea," for how long it might take to persuade a little old lady to give you her property.
But the owners weren't always little old ladies.
This is a several thousand acre parcel that was to be a new town. There were going to be high-rise developments on all these hills.
The proposed development was called Marincello.
The developer was very smart, and he bought our local politicians. Unfortunately, bought some of our local environmental leaders, too.
The developer had the backing of Gulf Oil, the giant corporation that owned most of the land. But Huey was determined to stop the project.
I was a negotiator going back and talking to Gulf Oil in Pittsburgh.
He's very consistent in the way he approaches life, hunting or working. He fixes upon a desired goal and with great respect for the system, goes about achieving it in a sustainable way.
We'd gotten people to tear up their Gulf credit cards and send them in, more and more and more, so that there were stacks of them in corporate meetings, creating this internal problem.
Eventually, Gulf cried uncle and agreed to sell the land to the Conservancy. The valley is now part of Golden Gate National Park.
It was one of those sort of defining, mobilizing sort of events that caused this people to understand what a precious resource that it had at the doorstep of this great metropolitan area, and how important it was that there be vigilance at the local level, grassroots level, to protect these properties.
It's a beautiful area. It's close to the large cities. It's just like the Vienna Woods is to Vienna. And we're blessed to have it, and it'll always be here.
But fights to save open space near metropolitan areas were the exception for the Conservancy.
It was great saving remote landscapes, elk refuges in Montana, whatever, but it was not going to help environmental quality struggles of the nation and world. Frankly, I was a little bored with the years. I put 9 years in building the Nature Conservancy in the West.
So in 1972, Huey left the Conservancy and started the Trust for Public Land to guarantee that urban areas would not lose their connection to nature.
Aldo Leopold said a weed in a city lot has the same lessons as a grove of redwoods.
Today, the Trust for Public Land is one of America's largest and most effective conservation organizations. In 1978, while he was still chairman of the trust, Huey's successes caught the attention of California Governor Jerry Brown.
He said, well, what do you think of the administration? I said, I'll give you some good marks, but I'll give you a D in environment. And he said, why? And I gave him some reasons. And he said, well, will you come to Sacramento? And I said, no.
Brown wanted Huey to be his resource secretary.
So he called me half a dozen times, and finally he just blew up. He said, well, it's people like you who are critical of government, who never do anything for it, that are our problem. He was raging away, and I said, well, thank you. And I hung up. I got thinking about it that you know, I'd never been in the military. I really did have an obligation, raised in the generation where honor is important, etc. So I said, okay, I'll go.
Huey wasted no time before making waves. He introduced a visionary new program called Investing for Prosperity.
The state had royalties from state-owned oil wells and state-owned grazing lands and state-owned forests. And I wanted to take the money for that into bringing back the productivity of renewable resources, the forests, waterways, and whatever. And that was a real struggle, but I did it. One of my obvious pet subjects was salmon. I was able to recover water to clear up salmon streams, and we had a goal of doubling salmon numbers and recovering them. We tripled the recovery by that. We put together an energy program that started selling the importance of conserving rather than just consuming. I proposed we look at alternatives, that we shut down nuclear, that we couldn't afford. Nuclear was a failed technology. So we put together plans, dreams really, and carried them out.
His energy-saving programs have now saved California taxpayers more than $30 billion. Bern Shanks worked with Huey while he was in Sacramento.
I met Huey in Butte, Montana. We both were at a conference on Sagebrush Rebellion, which was a move to take over the federal lands. After my speech, he said, I can't believe anybody from Utah State University, where Huey got his master's, is saying these things. And I said, well, they're trying to fire me. And just Huey's comeback was, why don't you come to work for me? He was the most unconventional top administrator I think anyone would ever meet. He dressed very casually. He would drop very important meetings with the governor, legislators, whatever. If the shad were running in the American River, he'd grab his pole and go out fishing. But for me, the interesting thing was that he had a great vision of what California and the West should be, the public lands.
Probably the most important thing I've done, most important accomplishment, is to motivate and inspire young people I've worked with to believe it was possible to go out and solve the environmental problem. They've gone out and they're doing it.
One of them was a young college student.
Huey chose me to go over and try to get $100 million for things like saving the wetlands and spawning salmon.
Then he sent Vera to sell a Wild Rivers Protection Plan to federal authorities.
They said no. We worked for several hours. When I walked out of the room, they had said yes by signing a federal state contract that resulted in the designation of the rivers. Huey sent me alone to meet the Secretary of the Interior and to persuade him and his staff to sign the document.
Huey left state government even more convinced of the need for comprehensive environmental planning.
I was still did and still do burn with that idea. And so I started what became the Resource Renewal Institute.
As he had in Sacramento, Huey hired bright young activists to advance his vision.
I show up in my suit, and he shows up in his race walking clothes and starts launching into this whole idea of a new green century. Now, I am at my most cynical at this point. I worked with Mother Jones magazine for a few years. George Duke Machen was governor of California. Ronald Reagan was the president. Now, this was not an optimistic time, and here is this guy telling me about his new Renaissance Center and how he was going to create a green plan, a 100-year plan for the world, for a livable future for our children and our grandchildren. Now, I thought he was a little square about this, and as his editor, I would actually strike those words from his writings every day, and every day they'd resurface. And pretty soon, I began to get it. And I believed in what he was doing. And that's what Huey can do for people. He gives people hope.
In the early 1990s, Huey discovered that several countries had developed comprehensive environmental policies called green plans. He was most impressed by what the Dutch were doing.
They're very reticent to talk about their own accomplishments. And so I thought, heck, we'll talk about their accomplishments for them. And we've done a lot of that.
Huey soon had a lot of other people going Dutch to see Holland's environmental program for themselves.
I was looking for ways to fund in the environmental community. And when I heard what he had to say, what was different from what he had to say, from what others had to say, was that that what was needed was a comprehensive effort, which made sense to me because I hated making the Sophie's choice of environmental issues. Do you pick water over air, or do you pick your children's health over the health of other life forms? And I didn't want to make that choice. I just felt that it needs to be managed better. And he said, yes, it is being managed better. It's being managed better over here, over in Holland and New Zealand and some other nations. And that caught my imagination. I wanted to help him.
A year shy of his 70th birthday, Huey Johnson isn't about to retire. Not when there are still so many people to persuade and a whole planet to save.
Huey's one of a kind. He's tenacious, he's tough, he's dedicated, he's honest. And he loves to frequent the thrift shops that I go to. So he's obviously got good taste as well.
He was hunted